Hello, and welcome to our webinar participants from around the globe. Thank you for joining us for today's event, the Postgraduate CV Guide. I'm Kate Warren, Executive Vice President at Devex, and today I'm going to be talking you through some of the ins and outs of global development CVs, particularly for those currently enrolled or about to graduate from school. But before we get started, I'd like to do a quick sound check. So if you could hit the green thumbs up that should be showing up on your screen if you can hear me. It'd also be great to get a sense of where you all are joining from today. So if you feel inclined, please feel free to use the chat box and let us know where you're based or what school you're part of. Okay, great. Sorry about that. I see that you all can hear me, so that's great. So I would like to point out a few things. We have actually a new webinar platform we're using this month if you've participated in previous ones. If you do have any technical or audio problems during the webinar, you can send a message through the Q&A box in the right-hand side of your screen, and one of my colleagues will be able to assist you. You can also submit any questions you have throughout the presentation, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can before the hour is up. And if you aren't able to attend the full presentation, we will be sending you a recording in the coming days, but hopefully you'll be able to stay with us through the duration and we'll be able to get to as many questions as we can. But for now, I will go ahead and get started and kick off. So one of the reasons that we are hosting this webinar, particularly for those of you who are in school, is if you are new to the development sector, we want to talk about some of the ways that global development CVs are different and why they are so important. As you're probably aware, if you've already started the job search, global development is actually a very competitive sector. There are a lot of people, particularly earlier career, that want to break into this work. So you really need to have a really standout CV in order to stand out from what can sometimes be hundreds, even thousands of applicants that are applying to some of these positions. There are also different norms and expectations in global development CVs than other industries. So your standard CV advice you maybe have heard before, either through your career center or for previous work experience that you've had outside of the development sector, it might be different as you look to prepare your CV or resume for global development jobs. So we want to talk through some of those differences. So some of the ways that development CVs do differ. You'll notice that I'm using the term CV, and that tends to be the more commonly used term in development than resume, although I would say that both can kind of be used interchangeably. So CV is typically a longer document that has more detail than a resume would, but in development, recruiters and hiring managers usually like to see more detail. So that one-page resume rule does not apply. Not to say you need to go beyond one page if you don't really have enough experience to fill it, but you don't need to stretch the margins, have really small font, and try to leave out really important information because you're just trying to fit into this what is commonly heard one-page rule. That doesn't apply so much in development. 2 to 3 pages, particularly if your earlier career, I think is a good baseline to try to keep your CV or resume. And again, when people use CV and resume, they tend to use them kind of interchangeably, whatever term they're more familiar with within the development context. So it's not quite the same differences that you might see in other industries. There are some other things to consider, for example, different cultural norms to balance. So if you are, for example, applying to jobs in a different geography than where you're from, there may be different norms about what kind of information you include on your CV. So for example, some countries it's very standard to include a photo or maybe even very personal details. But in other countries that may actually either not be the standard, but also could even be a negative. So you want to be really careful about adapting your CV and localizing it to the norms and customs of the geographies where you're applying to those positions. For example, in Germany, it can be common to have a photo on your CV, many countries in Asia as well, but within the US, it's actually considered kind of an odd thing to do. So even one way you could putting a picture could help you in some contexts, it actually could hurt you in others. Also, an interesting, unique way that hiring is done in development, if you aren't familiar with this, is at the proposal stage. What that means is there are many organizations, particularly the implementing NGOs and consulting firms that are doing grants and contracts for donors like USAID and DFID and DFAD and European Commission. They have to submit a proposal to the funder that includes the CVs of all of the staff that they anticipate would work on that project. And sometimes there are multiple organizations that are bidding on that same grant or contract. And so oftentimes organizations are out there hiring not for a position that's actually live today, but they're recruiting to put you on their proposal that they will submit to that funder. Then if they win that funding, then they would be in a position to hire you. So this can be a little confusing in two ways. One, you may notice if you go to the Devex job board that there could be multiple organizations that posted a job that sounds really similar and down to the exact same language. That's usually an indication that it is for a proposal. We actually do have a feature where employers can flag when positions are on a proposal or not, and it's a filter you can use. So you do have that transparency on knowing if it's a fully funded project, meaning they can hire you today, or they're recruiting for proposal, which means it's contingent on them winning the funding. All that being said, when CVs are included in a proposal, they really need to be written specifically for the requirements of that project. So it tends to be focused on really quantifiable skills and less on some of those softer skills that you might want to play up if it's for a more home office position. So if you are applying to a job that is at the proposal stage, becoming familiar with the request for proposal and the requirements of that specific project so that you can tailor your CV to those requirements will be really important. And again, that's kind of a very different, unique way of hiring that happens in the development sector. Also, some employers require a specific template. For example, there's the Europass in the EU or the P11 form within the UN system. So you'll want to make sure you have your CV in these various formats if you are interested in applying to jobs with these different kinds of employers. To talk a little bit about the CV versus the resume and generally it being similar, so I won't go into many more details on this, other than to again reiterate that the length of your CV is less important than really focusing on having relevant information. So don't focus so much on having a 1, 2, 3-page resume. Focus more on making sure that whatever you do include is really relevant to the job. So your CV should brand your core skills and experience. So it's really easy for whoever's looking at to really understand what it is you do, what is it you're bringing to the table. Your CV really is a marketing document. And so it really is like you think about your marketing collateral and assets. If you think of yourself as a brand, this is your most important marketing asset that you can put out there. You want to really think about the keywords that you use that are strategic so that you can show up in recruiter searches, whether you are applying to an employer through their online system. Most organizations use an applicant tracking system or some kind of online recruitment system that you will upload your CV and fill out an application form. Those systems rely a lot on keywords to help sort and filter applicants for recruiters, particularly for larger organizations where they may be receiving hundreds or again thousands of applications. They will rely on some of these tools to help them sift through and find the candidates that are most likely to be most relevant for the job. And one of the ways they do that is on keyword matches. So you really want to think about how you have the right keywords and the same keywords that are used in the job description so that you can get through some of those filters. Also, if you have your CV uploaded to like Devex, we have thousands of recruiters that use that to search for candidates for open positions. And what they are doing in addition to different filters is using keywords to find people with the kinds of experience they're looking for. So you want to make sure that you are using those right terms in your profile and your CV so that you would show up for some of those searches. A lot of positions are, particularly in consulting positions, are hired by recruiters or hiring managers doing their own searches and not necessarily posting a job. So it is important that you be thinking about these online profiles so that you can be found for jobs without, even needing to have to specifically apply. You also want to make sure that you are tailoring your CV to each position you apply to. This is really the #1 thing you can do. I would say that about 80% of applicants to jobs just send out the same, basically generic CV to each position they apply to. And so if you are that 10–20% that actually takes the time to tailor your application, it does two things for you. One, it actually shows attention to detail and motivation for the job and employer, things that people often say they have, and it can impress the recruiter to show that you took the time to actually really tailor your materials to their organization. The second is that it actually really helps you to make sure that you are framing the most relevant and important experience for that job. So we all have a wealth of experience, work history, education, things that we could put in our CV. It's really just kind of a highlights reel of our background and history. And so you want to make sure that you're selecting those experiences, those accomplishments that are most important for this job that'll show why you are right for this organization in this position. And doing so, while it takes more time, you will see much better return on your investment than sending off a bunch of generic CVs that you aren't tailoring to different jobs. Some of the things that your CV should include, specifically within the global development context, is that you do want to have a reverse chronological order of your work history. So that means starting with your current or previous job and working backwards. Some people that have had gaps in their career or looking to do a big transition sometimes consider doing a functional resume. I really strongly recommend not doing this, with the exception of some very unique cases, because it is usually very frustrating to a recruiter or hiring manager. They really want to see that reverse chronological work history. So even if you do have an area where you're talking about your skills and functional areas of expertise and less on your specific work history, you do need to have somewhere in your CV that reverse order of what jobs you've had, including the name of the employer. You definitely want to include the name of the donor or funder of any projects you worked on. This is something I see people leave off a lot, which is really doing you a disservice. So for example, if you worked for an NGO that ran a project that was funded by DFID, you want to make sure you're also including DFID on there, even though you weren't working directly for DFID. But it's important to employers to know that you have familiarity working with certain funders and donors that they may work with. So you want to make sure you're including those. Those are often keywords too that recruiters look for in a resume. If you've done project-based work, you also want to include the project name, including the acronym if there is one. So a lot of projects come up with these kind of cutesy acronyms like STAR or BRIDGE. And so some of them are, if it's a well-known large project or program, a lot of people know it by that acronym. So if so, you want to include that. But a lot of people may not be familiar with it, so don't just use the acronym. Also spell out the project name so it gives them an idea of what the real project is really focused on. You want to make sure you include the location of the job, including the country name. And again, this is because of keywords, where if you just include a city and somebody's doing a search for somebody with experience in a specific country, you may not show up. And then definitely the dates of employment. For some positions, again, particularly at the proposal stage and with large institutions like UN, World Bank, some of those groups, the years of experience is really important, and they will count it down to the month. So they want to make sure that you have those dates. You don't have to have the specific day that you started, but having the month and the year is really important. You can also include countries that you supported, even if you were not based there. So if you were working in the home office of an organization and supporting projects in Kenya or Afghanistan, be sure to include those countries. If you've done some travel and some short trips there, that's also important to include, so it shows you do have some on-the-ground experience. But having experience managing or backstopping projects in the country, even if you weren't based there, is all important information for an employer to know. Also, if you've worked on projects that there was a specific budget, I encourage you to include that as well, that bit of information. For some organizations, they really like to know if you have experience working on really large projects or budgets, or really small projects and budgets, and not to say one is better than the other, but they can be different in how they operate, and so it's often a bit of information they want to know if you have experience working with a project of that size and budget. I really encourage you to have a section for the languages spoken and countries of work experience. So particularly if you're looking to work in a region of the world where having a foreign language will be important, and this isn't all regions, but if you want to work in Latin America or Francophone Africa, speaking Spanish or French is really critical, if not a hard requirement. So you'll make sure you're very explicit about the languages that you speak. And then I do encourage that you have a section for countries of work experience. Even though you may already have that in your work history, having a separate section that lists all of the countries of work experience is helpful for a couple of reasons. One, it helps you again with those keywords, because most keyword searches, you rank higher with the frequency of those words in your CV. So it gives you more of those words in your CV to rank higher in searches. And also makes it very easy for an employer to look and see in one place all the different countries that you've had work experience in. And this is something that is pretty common for more seasoned development professionals. If you don't have overseas experience yet, that's okay, that's fine. But if you do, it is good to highlight that. And then you want to clarify your work authorization or citizenship status, because this is often a requirement for certain positions where they have to hire people to have existing work authorization or who are nationals of that country. Particularly in development, positions can be considered either an international hire, meaning the person can come really from anywhere in the world, or a local hire, meaning that they need to be somebody who is currently based and has work authorization in that country. So those are important details for them to know. Also include that you, encourage that you include a key qualifications section. And this is it can be bullet point or paragraph form, and I'll show you an example in a minute, where you highlight really your most impressive and relevant experience. And this can be kind of the first part of your CV. And I'll just actually click over here and show you an example. So I know this is a little bit small here, but if you look at that first key qualifications section, the first half of that first page of your CV is the most important real estate. So, newspaper speak, top of the fold, that was the most expensive advertising section. This is the same for your CV, because that's where the recruiter is going to spend the first few seconds scanning to decide if they want to continue reading your CV or not. So you want to make sure you're really grabbing their attention here. What's also nice about having a key qualifications section is it allows you to pull in and draw upon all of your education and work experience, even if it's further back in your history, to be right up top. So again, if you are tailoring your CV to a specific job, this is a great section to focus on. You don't necessarily have to rewrite your entire CV, but really edit and refine this section to be focused to that specific job, so that you're highlighting the most important relevant experience that is peppered throughout your CV, right up here, right up front, so it's the first thing they see. So things that, like, again, language, if you speak a language that's required of the job, if you have experience within a certain country or region that's required of the job, experience with that funder, experience with those sectoral or thematic program areas, you really want to make sure you focus that here. The other thing that I encourage you to have is a headline, which describes, 2 to 3, it could even be 1 if you have 1, core skills or areas of expertise that really brand yourself as an expert. And so this would be something you'd have right up top of your CV. It could be that you're a communications and advocacy expert, or climate change resilience expert, project management, monitoring, evaluation, whatever that is. It really helps set the tone. So again, when somebody has a few seconds to review your CV, they immediately know who you are, what it is that you're bringing to the table. You want to make sure that that is backed up and matched up by the experience in your CV, but it can be a great way to very quickly brand yourself and your expertise, so it's very easy for an organization to understand how you would fit into their organization. If you have kind of a mishmash of experience and you're still trying to figure out what it is that you have as your expertise, you think about some of those transferable or cross-cutting skills, and maybe it's by looking at, again, project management or cross-cutting programming or collaboration, fostering collaboration. Those kinds of things can also be good to highlight and actually can be really important to employers. A few other things I will, here is a little bit closer view of the key qualifications here. Another thing I will note is you do want to think about having very strategic, I guess, in choice bolding and italicizing, and you can use those to create interest, visual interest, and make a document easier to digest. But you also want to be somewhat restrained. So you don't want to use too many different colors and fonts so that it becomes hard to read. So you want to really make sure you're using it in a way that becomes, makes the document easier versus more challenging. Also in development, it's still fairly conservative as to the format and approach, but it can depend on the employer. And one clue to know if you're trying to figure out the tone and style of your CV, if it should be a more formal and conservative document, or whether or not you should try maybe a newer format or including a more design elements, is first of all kind of what kind of area you're working in. So if you are working in an area that's more in the design or creative field, having more creative format definitely can make sense. But also looking at the way that an organization describes themselves in their job posting and the language they use, you want to think about kind of mirroring that kind of language back, as it gives you an indication of the formality of them as an employer. Again, I do want to focus in on keywords and how important they are. And these are some of the key terms that you would see in job descriptions, and something I recommend doing is kind of looking through, if you look at the job posting and doing whether or not it's printed out and with a real highlighter or just kind of manually in your mind highlighting the specific terms that come out through this through the job posting is what they need. And some example ones maybe like program project management, monitoring evaluation, capacity building, training. And some of these are very buzzwordy and they can change depending on what the trend of the day is. So, capacity building and training is a good example. Often they can be one and the same. So you want to think about how you're describing your experience, and you're using the same language and mirroring the way that the organization is talking about that. So if they're all about capacity building, then you can be all about capacity building and how you talk about maybe your training experience. So you want to make sure that you're, again, customizing that and really thinking about how you are using language to make sure that you are getting through those filters, as well as usually the first recruiter or first person that's reading your CV will likely be fairly junior level and won't likely have a lot of subject matter expertise. So you want to make it very clear and obvious to them that you have the right experience. so that they are willing to pass along your CV to the hiring manager that maybe does have more subject matter expertise to make a deeper analysis. Thinking about acronyms, and development is a very acronym-heavy sector, so you I'm sure have seen many of them throughout your studies and reading, if you're reading news on Devex or job descriptions. So you want to think about how you use acronyms in a way that shows you are kind of insider and you understand the language. But you also want to avoid really overly technical jargon that somebody may not understand. For example, the first person who's reading your CV, if they aren't a subject matter expert, you want to avoid using jargon that they really wouldn't be familiar with. And if so, you can spell out the acronym at first, and then you put the acronym in parentheses, and then you can use the acronym throughout your CV. You also want to avoid using kind of non-development industry jargon and acronyms if you are transitioning from another sector, because again, that shows that you just maybe don't quite understand the development world so much, and it just doesn't fit into the context of what an organization is doing. So you want to avoid that language that makes you seem kind of a bit of an outsider versus insider. Let's do some of these here. When you're talking about your professional accomplishments, please don't just regurgitate what was in a job description and what was included in your maybe terms of reference about what you're supposed to do. For example, you're responsible for day-to-day operations of a region sub-office, responsible for the work done by staff and the overall success of the sub-office program. And that's not really showing like what you uniquely were able to accomplish. So don't be just looking at what you were supposed to do on the job. Show what you did, what you uniquely added, what impact you made. And a good formula for that is one commonly referred to as CAR, or talking about the context, the action you took, and the results. So for example, here's a rewritten paragraph where led team of 5 direct reports, including 2 project managers, 1 M&E specialist, a communications officer, and a security officer, and a previously underperforming regional sub-office. After 6 months, our office is recognized as having achieved the fastest growth rate of all 12 sub-offices. So that's giving more detail around the kind of people you managed and led. And again, that's the kind of detail that development recruiters and hiring managers like to know. And then it's also showing the impact that you had on that office. And impact, of course, is so important to the development sector. I think it's important to any other sector, and increasingly becoming so. So showing how you actually help drive results will be a real differentiator compared to other people who are just putting a list of duties that they performed. So some experience or advice for those who are about to graduate, and some of the things that I've seen people mistakenly do is, one is undervalue any of your administrative or even service-related job experience, particularly if you're in school. Maybe you were serving waiting tables or working in the administrative office of your university. And I've seen people leave that experience off in favor of more, supposedly impressive sounding development-focused experience. But actually, particularly if you are earlier career, many hiring managers and recruiters I talk to say that they really like to see that kind of experience on somebody's resume. It usually shows that, you have a strong work ethic, maybe have good customer service experience, which is really important to really any job in development. You're not afraid to, roll up your sleeves. And so having that kind of experience rounded out with whatever other maybe volunteer experience or more development-focused experience can actually make you a really compelling candidate. So don't leave those off thinking that they aren't impressive. Once you have a good amount of work experience, you don't need to include those, but if you are earlier career, it actually can help you, especially considering a lot of earlier career positions tend to be more administrative in nature, and it could be that your experience in those kind of jobs is actually more relevant to the day-to-day of entry-level position than other experience you may have had. The other piece of advice is to not overvalue travel or non-work-related international experiences. I've seen people do this quite a bit too, or they really play up a maybe voluntourism trip that they did or traveling backpacking trip they did, and it can come across as somewhat naive that you may think that that equates as, or is the same as actually working in a different country. And when you are applying to jobs with very seasoned development professionals who've maybe been in the trenches all over the world, it can come off again as a little naive to them. So you just want to make sure it's fine to include that, but you don't want to give the impression that you are equating that with actual work experience. So I've seen people put on their interests that they love to travel. That's great, that's fine, but pretty much anyone who works in international development likes to travel, and you don't want to give the impression that you're applying to the job just because you want to be able to have some free international trips. It's much more about the work and what you can do on the job than it is about you being able to travel. So I just caution how you talk about that and until you've built up some real work experience. Same is with just like passion. Well, that is really important, and this is a mission-driven sector, and employers want to hire people who are passionate about the work that they're in. That does not take the place of actual experience. Good intentions is great, that's important, but what is much more important is driving results and experience. So don't, again, play up that and forsake some of the other experience, which is actually much more important to the job. I would include if you haven't graduated yet, or you are maybe even a year away from graduation, definitely include your degree program and your education. And you probably want to have your education listed first before your work experience in your resume. And you can include the anticipated grad date there. Sometimes people include a lot of detail on the coursework they took. It's really frankly unlikely to move a recruiter or hiring manager. They frankly don't care too much about the courses you took, to be honest. They're going to care much more about any more practical hands-on experience. So if you've done a practicum where maybe you were embedded and working with an NGO on a project, or you spent some time in country working on a project, that kind of experience is great and really important to put on there. But just listing the courses you took is unlikely to really impress a hiring manager, and any extraneous detail that you put in your CV that's not super relevant to the job, it just dilutes the impact of what is really relevant. So really want to make sure you tighten that up. And if you do include coursework, make sure that it's a course that maybe is just really unique and really specific to that job. So maybe if it requires familiarity with certain statistical software and you took a class on that, that can be important to include. But just generally including your coursework is unlikely to help you too much. And then, of course, if you have any volunteer experience, and that's how most people get started out, is doing some volunteer or internship experience, definitely want to include that. And you can include that in your work history. If you don't have much work history previously, that can kind of count in lieu of. And when you're thinking about jobs to apply to, and they may require and say, 1 to 2 or 3 to 4 years work experience required, you can generally count some of the internship and volunteer experience under that umbrella. I did mention some of those larger institutions can be really strict about how they count experience, and some of them have formulas where they count volunteer internship experience, maybe 50%, but I would say most organizations are looser about that, and if you've had a little bit of volunteer internship experience, that can kind of count the same or similar to work experience when you're thinking about if you have enough years to qualify to apply to a job. And then I'll just kind of close here with some common sense CV tips. So always, apply consistent use of verb tenses. So make sure that those are consistent. Really have a very simple file name that you save your CV in. If you are sending it or emailing it around, I recommend like last name, first name, CV. I often, many times, see file names that are really messy that maybe have a bunch of different people's acronyms that have edited the document and versions, 16. It just looks really sloppy. And usually recruiters are trying to save these and send them around. They might have to rename it, so it's kind of annoying to them. It's just a really nice attention to detail to have a really clean, simple, clear file name. You could include the year that it was if you want, but that's just a nice touch that you can have that recruiters definitely notice. So you want to review, make sure little mistakes don't make you look bad. Not every person reviewing a CV is the same, so of course, caveat for any of this advice is we are all humans and all of us are different. So different people are going to want to see different things in your CV, and no two people are the same. Some people are very strict about any kind of errors, and if they see any at all, it's immediately to the no pile. Some are more forgiving, but you want to make sure, just to cover your bases, that you minimize that as much as you can. So you could ask for a friend to proofread your CV before sending. Obviously much easier for somebody else to catch those little mistakes when they are reading it for the first time than you are when you've been really immersed in the document. I know this is really basic, but don't forget to include your contact information. I can't tell you how many CVs and resumes I've had where that has been left off, and sometimes maybe it's because it was sent through an email and it was you send it in an email so that they have your email address, or it has your signature in the email with all of your contact information. But CVs can move around, be passed around. So if somebody ends up with your CV, you want to make sure they are able to contact you. And when it comes to that, make sure you have a professional sounding email address. So if you have one that you've been using, particularly if you haven't had much work experience yet, that's maybe around like a hobby that you have, I encourage you to just create a new one that is your name, pretty simple, basic, that will just come across as more polished and professional. And then I also recommend sending your CV in a PDF file. It helps make sure that it locks the formatting, and also make sure that nobody can kind of doctor your CV later. But it gives it a cleaner presentation, just to make sure that depending on what program somebody's downloading it, that they'll be able to read it in the format that you intended it to be in. Great. Well, I am going to move over to some questions. Again, if you have any, you can submit them in the Q&A chat box, and we'll try to get to as many in the 20 minutes or so that remains. So here's the first one. If I have lived extensively, grew up in other countries like Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, do I include that in my CV? Yeah, I think that is important, and I would really more focus that in your cover letter. I think your cover letter is a better place to really talk about who you are as an overall person. It's less that quantifiable experience, but more about how all of your life experiences would make you a great candidate for a position, including your motivations. So talk about that, and I'd really try to tie it to how it's relevant and would bring value to that employer and that organization, where it may be understanding the cultural context and the political and economic realities, maybe different languages. You could include that in the key qualifications section if the position really requires somebody with experience in one of those countries. You could include it there. If not, I'd really focus that on your cover letter. Would be a good place to include that. That's a question. My CV is 7 pages. I've tried to shorten it to no avail. I hear you. I know it can be challenging, and what is often challenging, particularly if you're somebody, and this is very common in development, that people work as a consultant where they do a lot of short-term projects. So maybe they have a 2-week assignment here and 3-month assignment there, and before you know it, you have pages of work experience if you want to include all of those. So some ways to get around that is having just selected assignments and making that clear by saying, maybe you worked as a consultant between these years, and say, selected relevant projects include, so it's clear that this isn't an exhaustive list, but you're really focusing on what's most relevant to that organization or that position, and then making sure you have a good coverage of no major gaps in time there too, as you think about balancing that. So some people use that approach to shorten their CV. Again, really think about anything that's not relevant to the job, to cut that out, even though it can be painful if you feel like, but this is a great experience and I'm really proud of it and I want it on here. If it's not relevant to that position, it could be doing you more of a disservice. So encourage you to try to cut some of that out. You could have a friend try to look at it. We do a CV writing service here at Devex, so we'll pair you with one of our CV experts, and it's a lot of what they often help people do is how to shorten and cut down their CV length. Because to be honest, most people do not look past those first few pages. Having all that extra information in there is really not necessarily helping you. If you can get it down like 3 to 5 pages, if you have a good amount of experience, you can get up to 5 pages. But beyond that, it's really hard to get somebody's attention. Next question. Hi, I actually ran my own PR events company for 5 years, working with several national NGOs prior to going back to school and earning a master's degree in international law and diplomacy. How would you recommend I list this on my CV? Self-employed, company name? Yeah, that's a great question. So similar to what I mentioned before about people who do more like independent consulting, I think you could definitely put your company name and have, if you had a title there, or founder or whatever it may be, then, or self-employed, include that, and then list the different events and projects you did. And if there are too many to make your CV really long, you can choose and like highlights and just the most relevant ones to highlight under there. Don't necessarily have to list every single event company, but more generally talk about what you did and some examples of projects and clients that you think would be most relevant to those jobs. You can also put it as a independent consultant in your name. That's very common within development to do that. So kind of your preference on whether or not you want to use company name or just independent consultant. One thing that I would say if you're trying to make that decision is sometimes there's a hesitation by employers to hire somebody for a full-time position if all of their work experience has been as an independent consultant, because they have concerns about your willingness or to fit into a kind of full-time work office environment when most of your experience maybe has been more flexible as a consultant. So sometimes that's a concern, that if you're facing, you may want to use more of a company name and maybe don't even want to position yourself as the founder, because then maybe it could appear you're overqualified for the job. But I think both approaches would work fine. And as you think about your education or work experience, what to put, if you haven't done much work while you're in school, so you would have a gap, definitely put your education first. If you've still been doing work while you've been in school and the work is more relevant to the jobs you're applying to, put that first. If your degree program is more relevant, then you could put that first. Next question. Hi, I have relevant experience in my home country, and now I'm trying to make the leap to international postings. Is there any tip on how to showcase this in the CV? Yeah, so that's one of the, I think, biggest challenges people have is making that leap to international experience, and it's very much this chicken and the egg dilemma where most of the jobs require previous international experience, but how do you ever get one of those if you all the positions require you already have it? So it can be hard to get that first one, and then once you do, it becomes much easier to move around. I would say looking at regional positions can be a good first step, and particularly if it's a country that you have similar culture or language that you can draw upon, or similar political, economic environment that would be very transferable. So, that can be a good place to look. The other is looking at like fragile conflict areas where, frankly, is less competition and there's a lot of need. A real trend in development is that whenever possible, organizations want to hire locally, not necessarily bring in an international hire. Bring in international hire is more expensive, and they don't know the local context as well as somebody who is from there. So it really makes sense to always hire locally whenever possible. But in places experiencing conflict and fragile environments, there often is not that local capacity, and they do need to bring in more people internationally. And so that's often where people will get their first experience. Now, it's not an easy work environment, but if you are interested and willing and working in one of those contexts, you might find that easier just because there's a greater need and less people willing to do it. The other is looking at doing volunteer experience. There's even UNV that does is the UN Volunteers Program. There's many other volunteer programs that can help you kind of break through that cycle of getting that first international posting. And then if you've worked with an organization, if so, for example, if you look for an international NGO in your home country that works in different countries, I've seen a lot of people been able to branch out into an international career because they've so impressed their employer that that employer is actually willing to relocate them to a different country if they indicate that preference. But as far as if you want to be working in another country and when you're applying and how to indicate that, we are actually going to be in the next couple weeks adding a feature on Devex where employers can indicate if a position is for a local or international hire, which I think will actually be helpful for you to see if a position's open to hiring international candidates so that you can focus on applying to those. And just by nature of applying, I think it's assumed that you're willing to and wanting to relocate. But otherwise, I don't think you necessarily need to indicate that other than just to apply to jobs that are international. And I think it'll be assumed that you're interested in wanting to work in a different country other than your own. Okay. Another question. If you're a graduate student with a few years of experience prior to school, should you include your education or experience first in your CV? Great. Yeah, I'll just follow up a little bit more on what I said to the previous questioner. And typically, you just want to lead with what is most relevant and recent, kind of balancing those two. So if you haven't had a lot of work experience while you're in school, then definitely put your degree first. Some people work while they're in school, so they're also getting work experience. And frankly, work experience will trump your degree. So while it's important to have that degree, and many positions require a master's degree, it can be somewhat like checking a box, and then they're going to want to see that you have the experience. So if your experience is more recent and relevant, lead with that. If you are transitioning from another sector and you went back to graduate school as part of that transition to show how you have gained more experience, then you would likely want to lead with your degree. So say you had more of a private sector background and you went and got your master's in international development, you can lead with that, and it really showcases that, yes, you are looking to make that leap into international development, and then put your work history. So really use that as your guiding force, what's most recent and relevant, and use that first. And it could be different depending on the job that you're applying to, but generally people tend to fall in one camp or the other. Okay. Question, what are your thoughts on using colors and graphics in creating a resume? Do you know other ways that one can make a resume interesting to look at? Yeah, that's a good question, and I've seen some really interesting formats out there that include different like graphics and like infographics on there to showcase even soft skills or even highlight references that past employers have had about them. And I think they can actually be really intriguing. It's still, I think, undecisive around how people receive them. As I mentioned earlier, there's every person who's looking at CVs has different preferences. So all of this advice is in the caveat, this is generally good practice, but some people have different preferences over others. I know some people really are intrigued, and it really helps stand out when they see a more uniquely formatted CV and resume. And again, this tends to be more important if you're in more of a creative space as far as your expertise, and it's a way to show that creativity. But some people are still pretty conservative in how they want to review a CV. And a lot of that comes down, is passed down from the funders. So it's when I talked about that whole proposal recruitment process, and an employer needs to put that CV in the proposal. If you're applying to a job like that that's on a project, they likely will have to get approval from the funder or be putting your CV in a proposal, in which case they're probably going to have a pretty strict standard, more plain format that is the preferred use. If it's more of a home office job, or you're applying to an organization that maybe is more like a social enterprise, or it's more of an innovative, even maybe tech-focused company, then trying a different format might actually help. So again, playing the cues of the employer and how they talk about themselves, how they present their job description, gives you a good indication of what kind of culture they are, and so what kind of format to show how you would fit into that culture would be best to use. Question, can we have a model of a CV to refer to? Yeah, I will actually post a link to, we have an article on Devex that you have access to with your career account that has different CV templates that we've developed, and some of them are specific to, let me post this here. Some of them are specific to certain employers, and then some are kind of more general. So whichever one is easier for you to use, and I think I just submitted that to everyone here, a link. I want to maybe one of my colleagues can also share that as a resource to make that easier for you to find. But you can actually download those templates and use them if you prefer to use any of those. Let's see. Could you define keywords versus buzzwords? Are you motivated, driven versus data management experience? Yeah, great question. So, I mean, sometimes it can be one and the same. Sometimes keywords definitely are very buzzwordy. But I would say is some of you need to back them up. So you need to have experience to back them up. So if you talk about being motivated and driven and, team builder, consensus builder, problem solver, some of these things, that's great, but you need to back it up with experience. It's not enough to just say you are that person. I mentioned people often talk about being detail-oriented, and then they have a bunch of mistakes in their resume, and they haven't really tailored it to the job, and they have a really messy file name for the CV. None of those things communicate that you are detail-oriented. So you do want to think about how you are demonstrating that through your document, and then also talking about your experiences. So being able to talk about your previous work experience or other experience in a way that shows how you have applied those skills and have that, buzzwordy experience is really important. So it's not enough to just say it. You have to also show it. Hopefully that helps there. Okay, next question. I'm a grad student and did a 1-year-long capstone project. How do I mention this in my CV? Under work experience? That's great, and I think is really important experience to highlight, and I think it's really great when graduate programs give you that opportunity, as it really helps show a practical experience that would relate to jobs on hand. So definitely include this, and I think you could include it under work experience, particularly if it was that you were say, working with an organization as part of this project and, providing a real service to them. I think you could include it under there. I mean, you want to make sure that you're not misrepresenting it and that you include it as a project, but I would consider that under the umbrella of professional or work experience, and would definitely encourage you to highlight that. And then you also can do, if you have a key qualifications section, you could highlight it there, or also in your cover letter would be a great place to talk about that experience, and particularly how that experience you think better prepared you for the jobs at hand. Okay, next question. What about courses and trainings? In my CV, the list is long, so what do you suggest? Should I cut it down, or e-courses considered valuable by employers? Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that we do an annual survey of recruiters, and we often ask them about this. And the answer is usually it depends. Again, usually experience trumps courses and education. So what's most important is showing how you've actually used those trainings and courses versus just listing the ones you've done. But it is good to have on there, and you want to make sure that they are really focused to that job. So if you've taken different statistical courses, and you're applying to M&E jobs, and those are really important, definitely include those. If it's something that's less relevant to the job and it's just kind of adding more pages to your CV, you can leave those out. Any courses you can show how you actually were able to use those on the job, those would be ones that would be great to prioritize. And e-courses can be considered valuable depending on who delivered them. There's differing reputations of providers out there, and so it can really depend. Absent any other experience, it's good to put, but once you do have really good work experience, that tends to trump any additional trainings and courses. Okay, let's do a couple more questions here. I did a year-long VC-based internship under a program that worked in Nepal, Indonesia, and Niger. You mentioned including country support even if I wasn't there. Would you recommend including this closer to the language skills section or having those countries embedded in the job description? Yeah, I would embed those in the job description. You can mention that in a skills section as well, so you can do both. It doesn't have to be either or. The key qualification skills section is really meant for you to pull out what is most relevant that's already in your CV to be up top. So that is meant to be repetitive to what you have below. It's just kind of pulling up the highlights that's most relevant to that job. But I would definitely include that in your work history. Before my master's, I worked in a nonprofit, and while some skills overlap, it wasn't international development. When employers ask for years of experience, can I count these years? And how do I translate fundraising and advocacy work with my transition into development? Yes, I would definitely count those as years of experience. It is very transferable, and if you were doing more domestic nonprofit work, I think that a lot of that can be very transferable to development. So those years of experience definitely count. So you just want to think about how you focus on what is the most transferable skills and experience to the jobs you're looking at. Fundraising and advocacy is a big part of international development work. So looking at jobs that would draw upon that experience would be a good strategy for you, because it would be an easier leap and they would value those years of experience more than if you're looking to do just complete change. Fundraising and development can take many shapes. So a lot of times it's actually through what might be called business development or program development, where it's actually responding to requests for proposals with large funders. And so they often don't describe it as fundraising. They would consider fundraising doing more traditional, maybe individual contributions or donations from corporations, where the way they do most of their fundraising is through a business development process. So again, when you think about the language you use to describe your experience, you'd want to be familiar with those differences. And if you have some of that work that's more like proposal development and getting grant funding, that is very transferable, and you just want to make sure you're describing it in those terms and maybe not using the term fundraising as much. Are there other ways to identify whether an organization is recruiting on a proposal? Yes, there are some key identifiers. One is that they might describe it as an anticipated or forthcoming project. That's often common when they describe the position or the project. So that anticipated or forthcoming is a clue that it is not fully live and that they are in the process of bidding on that. And then again, if you see multiple jobs that have the same title, location, same general job description posted by different employers, that's an indication that there are multiple organizations that are bidding on that same project, and so they're all looking for people to include on that bid. So those are another couple of clues. All right. To jump off the living abroad question, if I change citizenship during my job search, how can I effectively convey that I have cultural understanding of the area I'm interested in and grew up in while having a different nationality? Yeah, well, actually, I think you can include, while I don't know if like you're technically a citizen of both or not, that you can include your nationality and citizenship. Many organizations actually really look for people that are from the diaspora from a country when they're hiring. So they maybe, if they can't find somebody with the right experience locally, their often ideal candidate is somebody who comes from the diaspora that maybe has that experience, is no longer living there, and is willing to come back. So that, you know, could be a good area for you to target. But you also, again, in your cover letter can talk about that. But I would include both in your CV as well. And that's pretty common to do. And you see there are many professionals that have, you know, multiple nationalities or citizenships on their CV, and that can definitely be considered a plus. All right, I know we're running out of time here, but trying to get just a couple more questions here. Where do I put the legal status work permit? I would put that right up top under your name, and you know, the very key details there is a good place to put it, just to make sure that it doesn't get overlooked and it's right up top. Then another question here. Some companies ask to put current salary and expected salary. What's the best place to put these? Yeah, that's a good question. So if you're working with, say, with a USAID implementer, they often have to submit what's called a biodata form, which has your previous 3 years salary and work history. So they may ask you to fill that out. But absent that, I tend to encourage you to just put salary negotiable rather than having to put a number right up front. If they like your experience and they're interested in you, I don't know of any recruiter that would not reach out because you didn't put an exact number there. And then you can do, you know, some research on what you think the market rates are for that location, that kind of job, that kind of organization, and if it does come to time to negotiate the salary. With that being said, if you have very strict salary requirements and you don't even want to entertain a job if they're not going to be able to offer you, then you can put that there and put it out there, knowing that if it's higher than what they are willing to pay, but you wouldn't be willing to take that anyway, that I think that can also be a good approach. But if you are a little more flexible, then I think it's fine to say that even if they ask for you to put your salary requirements. They may follow up with you afterwards, but you want to, I think, try to get as far along the process as you can before you start having those conversations. All right, I know there's a few other questions here on like how to search when you're still in school. We actually did hold a webinar earlier this year on that hopefully we can pull up and send you the link so that you maybe could watch that on how to get job search ready while you're already in school. And another question on PDFs being keyword searchable. You can do a searchable PDF, so that's a really good point. You want to make sure that you have the searchable format. And then CV tips for mid-level professionals doing career pivot that may not be entry level. For career transitioners, we did a CV webinar earlier this year where we focused on that, and I think we pulled out a few clips that we'll try to share on specifically how to do your CV for transitioning. But really the key takeaways are, you focus on those transferable skills and again on the language that you're using, and realize that a career pivot, it may take a couple of job changes. So the people I've seen do it most successfully are the ones that look at the jobs that have the most overlap with their previous skills and experience. So it's an easier transition in, but they'll allow them to gain some new skills and experience that will better position them to do, another pivot to maybe where it is they really do want to go. But the most important thing is just getting your foot in the door and breaking into the development sector. It's a lot easier to move around then. So you want to look at the jobs where you'll have the best chance of breaking in and gain some more experience and build up your reputation and network that will make it easier to pivot to the kinds of jobs that you ultimately want to have if they tend to be quite different than what you're doing today. All right. Well, I'm sorry we're a little over time here, and I wanted to try to wrap up as many questions as we could. But thank you all so much for participating and sending in so many great questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get through all of them, but hopefully we got through most of them, and any others that came in we were able to answer through some of the other questions. Remember, if you do have any questions about anything in your career search, you can always join our quarterly Ask Devex event, where I and often other development recruiters will be on hand to help answer any of your questions. So stay tuned for our next one. And then we do have another career event taking place on Thursday, the 25th of April at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And this is part of our ongoing conversation with women working in STEM. And in honor of International Day of Girls in ICT, we'll be sitting down with a few dynamic women using their expertise in the STEM field to make a difference in the world. So if you are interested in STEM careers, this could be a really good event for you to participate in. And we hope to see you for that event or another future event. Please stay tuned for we have a lot more programming coming up in the future. And if there's anything you'd like to see us cover, please let us know. We always love hearing from our community and members about what advice they'd like us to prepare. So we're always open to hearing your ideas. So feel free to send those over to us. Again, thank you for joining us today, and look forward to speaking with you in a future event.